So I'm a Christian, and I assume you're a skeptic. My goal is to explain why I think Christians are justified in thinking that the Gospel of John relates true events in a truthful way. Before discussing the date and authorship of John, I'd like to highlight what I think are two bad ways to assess the credibility of John's account. First, I think it's mostly a waste of your time to focus on the Christian doctrine that John's Gospel contains no inaccuracies. When I first read John as a young atheist, I didn't think it was inspired by God or inerrant. So what? I wouldn't have thought that about any historical account, ancient or modern. But that doesn't mean ancient histories are all garbage and only archaeology can tell us reliable truths about the past. If you read eyewitness accounts of Lincoln's assassination and your only finding is that there are discrepancies, you haven't made much progress as a historian. Do discrepancies imply that Lincoln wasn't killed or that Booth wasn't the assassin? Now, I understand that it's annoying that Christians use inerrancy as a defense against criticisms of the Bible, but that doesn't mean Christian doctrine should drive your agenda in assessing the significance and historicity of the events recorded in a gospel. A second mistake is to think that anyone can demonstrate scientifically that John is or isn't mostly telling the truth about Jesus. Most of what's described in any ancient historical record simply isn't open to much scientific scrutiny. I don't mean that science shouldn't lead a modern thinker to be skeptical about Jesus' miracles or the extraordinary claim that Jesus was the Son of God. But even if you think science in principle is grounds for discounting all the miracles in John, you still haven't made a judgment about most of what's recorded in his gospel. We'll talk about miracles in future videos, but for now, let's start with the simpler question of John's authorship and date. All the earliest copies of John's Gospel associate its author with the name John, and it's written clearly in a few places in the Gospel that this author, John, was an eyewitness to the events. For example, in chapter 21, verse 24, where this John is walking with Peter and Jesus, the text says, "This is the disciple bearing witness about these things, and who has written these things." There are at least three reasons to think that the author really was an eyewitness. First, the earliest church fathers affirm that this John was a disciple of Jesus during his ministry. Second, since almost all scholars date the gospel to somewhere between 60 and 100 AD, with most leaning to the 90s, it's chronologically plausible that a disciple of Jesus was alive during this time to publish their account. And third, the author appears not only to have had detailed knowledge of the geography and culture of Palestine, but also seems to have been intimately familiar with the household of the high priest. But even though an eyewitness account is more reliable than a non-eyewitness account, that hardly means it's always an accurate account, since eyewitnesses commonly misremember or exaggerate what happened. Still, an eyewitness account does challenge skepticism more than a non-eyewitness account. For example, at the end of the book, the eyewitness claims to be eating breakfast with Jesus a few days after Jesus has died. This suggests the eyewitness is either lying, delusional, speaking metaphorically, or simply telling us a true event that's difficult to believe. To be clear, I don't think it's persuasive when Christians argue that John's Gospel is inerrant or even reliable merely because the author, or at least the source of the content, really was an eyewitness. But neither should a skeptic deny that a Christian's case is strengthened for believing in John's general truthfulness if its author was an eyewitness. But how can we assess how important it was to John to be accurate in recording what he claims to have witnessed Jesus doing and saying? One way is to see if there is any evidence in the Gospel itself that reveals John's concern for relating the sayings of Jesus accurately. We have a few examples, but I'll focus on just one. In the final scene of the Gospel, where Peter asks Jesus whether John will be martyred, Jesus replies as follows, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me." So the saying spread abroad among the brothers that this disciple was not to die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he was not to die, but, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you?" A rumor had spread abroad among the early Christians that John was never going to die. The rumor arose from two things. First, John lived until he was very old, probably a lot longer than the other disciples. And second, Jesus himself had made a statement that seemed to suggest it. But John corrects the false rumor by emphasizing the difference between what many Christians asserted Jesus meant, this disciple's not going to die, versus the exact words Jesus spoke. If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Jesus' original statement is indefinite about John's fate, and yet one can see how the statement was misconstrued. This hardly demonstrates that John always records Jesus' words as accurately as he can remember them, but it does give a rare insight into how much value John placed on the exact words Jesus said. And we have two reasons to think this little scene is revealing what John really thought. First, the scene is peripheral to the main thrust of John's claims in the gospel. And second, the scene doesn't convey details that are open to the charge of exaggeration. I hope this has been helpful to you in some way, and I'll try to respond to thoughtful questions and criticisms in the comments section.